Hi there, welcome back to the Community of Readers video blog. We're following the Old Testament readings for the Monkey Bar Challenge, and this week we take another look at the whole of the book of Leviticus. This is called Better Think Twice. It's a common misconception that the sacrifices of Leviticus are designed for the removal of moral guilt from the people. It's an easy mistake to make. Most of the system is construed in terms of right and wrong. It uses the language of atonement and sin. But the mistake that we make is to assume that those words meant the same for the ancient Israelites as we understand them to mean today. First of all, there's a whole raft of different types of sacrifices in Leviticus. So there's sacrifices for the reconciliation of two parties who've fallen out and need to make up. There's the thank offering for the safe arrival of a child or a good harvest. And there's often sacrifices for prayer for a safe journey or for physical healing. And then there are the sin offerings and the guilt offerings. And the key with both of those is that they are specifically for unintentional offences. So the sin offering is for unintentional offences as regards any of the Lord's commands, it's chapter 4 verse 2, and the guilt offering for unintentional offences in relation to any of the Lord's holy things, chapter 5 verse 15. Now some of the sacrifices are for things that are very clearly amoral. In other words, they have no particular morality one way or the other. So, for example, you must offer some lamb's flour and oil once you've been cleansed of an infectious skin disease. You offer a lamb and a pigeon after childbirth. You bring a couple of doves after each monthly period, and you bring a couple of pigeons for any other bodily discharge. The thing is, for intentional sins, there is no sacrifice. For intentional sins, there is no sacrifice. So the sin that we understand the sin and guilt offerings to be dealing with is clearly something that is only part of a much bigger Israelite understanding of sin, and definitely something that is very different from how we understand sin today. The sin that the sin and guilt offerings deal with is to do with the Israelites' ritual status before God. It doesn't trivialise it, because ritual sin was a big deal for the Israelites, but it's not primarily an issue of morality, it's an issue of worship. This is how we have to understand the elaborate system of the Israelites. Of course, morality was an important feature for the Israelites. It was a defining feature of their whole religion, that they were different. They followed this holy, different God. But their morality wasn't the defining feature. The defining feature was their holy God, not just the moral code that they lived by. So the whole system is designed to preserve proper worship of Yahweh. Every Israelite had a choice. Were they going to worship Yahweh, or were they going to follow Molech or Baal or Osiris or the local goat idols? Everything is arranged to make sure that Israel remain a Yahweh worshipping community. So the sacrifices made for sin and guilt are for ritual cleansing. Any offence made against a fellow human is moral and requires either restitution or punishment. But the sacrifice, the offence made against God, was that of defiling oneself in regard to proper worship. It's the direction and the allegiance of a person's life that needs reaffirming before Yahweh. It's not the individual cleansing of a particular moral misdemeanour. In other words, from the perspective of the sacrificial system, it's Israel's relationship with God that is the primary concern, and that is more than the sum of the moral parts. So what is there then for those who do sin intentionally? Well, any person doing the detestable things, quote, listed in chapter 18, must be cut off from their people, just sent away, out of the community forever. And in chapter 20, there's a whole list of offences, including those who curse their mother and father, adulterers, those who practice incest, homosexuals, those who have sex with animals, mediums or spiritists. They must all be put to death, as should in chapter 24 blasphemers, who need to be stoned, and in chapter 21, if a priest's daughter becomes a prostitute, she must be burned with fire. So that's basically the answer. For most sins, you're excommunicated or you're killed. But there were some commands given where the due penalty isn't death or excommunication, and that's where the Day of Atonement comes in. So on the Day of Atonement, three things happen. The priest makes a sacrifice for himself, then he makes a sacrifice for the people, and then the sin of the community is placed on the goat, which is sent out into the desert. Now the first two sacrifices are for ritual cleansing, they're sin offerings. So they are for unintentional offences. And then it's the placing of the sin onto the goat who's sent out, which is the removal of the moral sin from the community. Now it's often said that God's holiness is so great that he needs sacrifice in order to deal with sin. It needs to be life for life in payment for the offence of sin to such a holy God. But that isn't the story of Leviticus at all. Because the whole point is that the sacrifices aren't there to make the Israelites morally acceptable. That's what the commandments are for. So the whole of Leviticus, I think, is designed to give the community a total allegiance to a God who wants them to understand that allegiance is costly. Even good women would have periods and have mildew in their home and needed to be reminded of God's presence with them. Even good men would get skin diseases or touch a dead animal and needed to be reminded of God's presence with them. There's something deeply profound here, because the whole system is designed to bring the worship of Yahweh into every aspect of the Israelites' life. Their God was different, called them to a different life. And the sacrifices are designed to imbue into the Israelite psyche a determination to follow this different God in their world. Now, obviously for us, elaborate systems of ritualized piety are not really an issue anymore. Certainly for the first Jewish Christians, they engaged in some very creative theology, saying that Jesus was the high priest, the great high priest who offered a sacrifice once and for all, so that all who came in him were now ritually pure. And by bearing in himself the death penalty stated in Leviticus for all of the moral offences, he became a substitute for humankind. But because of his innocence, the substitution is ongoing, it never sticks. But the Levitical system is still, I think, still has much to teach us, despite being in and of itself completely obsolete. because as a source of inspiration for our spirituality, Leviticus inspires us to imagine a faith where God is in every aspect of our life. Rather than reserving worship for an hour on Sundays, how can our lives become totally oriented towards the God we worship? Where is God in the Tesco trip or the school run? Where is God in the board meeting or the classroom? What can we bring to God as a gift of thanks? How do we acknowledge God when we make up with a former enemy? How can we bring an awareness of God into our work, our school, our home? Now, under grace, we're free to come up with those answers on our own, rather than have them imposed on us from above. Here's a couple of questions for reflection. What are you willing to sacrifice to be inspiringly different? And how can you create moments of worship in the everyday humdrum that allow you to affirm your direction and allegiance to God? You can find out more about Community of Readers and the Monkey Bar Challenge at our website, communityofreaders.com. Till next week, the first part of the Book of Numbers. Have a great week. Cheers.